So, hi there, my name's Charles. I work for Clutch Technologies here in Atlanta. We are a car subscription company and recently acquired by Cox Automotive, always fun. And I lead our mobile team there. I'm also our lead Android engineer. The talk today comes from a problem that I've had at this job, problem I've had at another job that I used to have, and the need to not be doing a lot of work in Gradle if I don't have to. So if you've ever worked with product flavors in Android, you can do some really cool stuff. The ability to have a lot of different functionality or the visibility of different attributes, all sorts of stuff can be controlled that way. Different servers that you point to is a common thing. Before some of this stuff got smarter in the Play Store, having a paid version of your app and a free version based on a product flavor was the cool thing to do. I think there's still a lot of examples that use that out there. One of the other uses for it is for white labeling apps. If you have an app that's a shell and you want to build it 12 different ways for 12 different people, your Gradle file can get real big, real fast. If you've got things with your manifest file that can go in there, you've got your actual build flags that you can set. You've got also the source code files that you can include or not include. So the other part of that is Gradle is really slow to refresh. And as you add dimensions and flavors to your Gradle project, that refresh rate gets real slow. I put O of n squared. It may actually be worse. I'm not sure. So the other part of it is I am an Android engineer. I don't really love the part of my job that is, hey, we got this new partner. We need you to add their icon to the app. That's not a fun part of my job. Making things do what they're supposed to do and jump and animate and actually function, that's a lot more fun. So the other part that goes into is who else is going to do it? If not me, it's got to be someone else who has that Android domain knowledge, the Gradle domain knowledge to add that stuff in, or I have to write a script that's going to go in and mess with a project file that could then break how my app works next time. You're creating crashes within your commits, who knows? It gets very fragile very fast. So I decided a while ago that the solution was a Gradle plugin. The Gradle build system is really robust. It's also really, really badly documented. So this is a scary thing. Has anybody in here tried writing a Gradle plugin of their own? Got a couple hands. How many of you actually got into the finish line with it? Fewer hands. 1.5 hands. So it's tough. There's not a lot of documentation, and there's no good reason for that, but it's the state that it's in, so it's what we have to deal with. So for this, the solution that I came up with was a Gradle plugin that instead of using product flavors within the Gradle file, it loads those in by scanning a directory. So I have a directory somewhere, doesn't matter where. It has subfolders. Each one of those folders becomes a flavor within a white label dimension. And under that, I can have all the same resource files that get merged at, just like any other flavor would when you're building. And it's the same structure, so it's really easy to migrate over. But also, I can add in all of those extra pieces, the manifest stuff, the application ID, flags that you might want to set. All of that stuff is now there. The big gain that got me is that means that on my build machine, I can have the core flavor, the version of the app that's just the version I need to run. So when I sync up my Gradle, there's only one flavor for that to deal with. It's much, much faster. It also means when I go to run it, I know which one I'm running. I don't have to go dig through 100 flavor dimension variants in my build variant dropdown. So you've got this trimmed down version on your machine locally, which also means if there's a special version that I need to run, we've got a bug, I can just download that one directory and refresh Gradle and go. It's that easy. It's designed to be super simple. What it also means is on the CI server, I can manage how those directories are loaded at build time or compile time, to download different folders for different builds off of different branches, or when I go to push a release, it can download and mesh together several layers of those depending on what I'm trying to accomplish. But it doesn't have to be me. It means that my backend guys can write all of the configuration stuff into their side, and right now they can just deliver me a zip file that is the folders that I need with the structure underneath them, that I can just write a quick script like, hey, when someone uploads an icon at 512 by 512, spit out this structure into the database. Done, I can walk away. And that means that now I don't have to care when there's a new white label app to go out. Someone who is a marketing person, a product person, can go into a website somewhere and upload files, paste config values, type in app names, hit save, and it's done. It's designed that I don't have to lift a finger, because that means I can be doing the cool stuff that we all actually want to be doing. So the big thing about how it works, in the Gradle pipeline, most of us are used to applying plugins in your Gradle file at the very top. It's like, okay, you've got Android and then Kotlin now, and maybe some other ones that you've added. Another one I work on is the Gradle Play Publisher that we'll touch on a little later. You're adding those things at the top. This actually turned out to be the hiccup in a lot of what I kept trying to work on, because the way that it reads that file is top to bottom, and that actually makes a difference. And that's why the Google GMS one, if you use Firebase, goes at the very end, because it's operating on some different pieces. So it turns out that for something like this, where I'm trying to take, I need things to already exist in the Android setup. I had to put it at the end, and this was the trick that I learned, because there was no documentation, just by playing around. These are the kinds of things that if you have a build process that you want to improve, or some other piece that you think a Gradle plugin could solve for, there's some gotchas, and that's one of them. That was the first one I came across, was as I'm trying to figure this out, at the beginning of the file, there's no Android anything. You can link into when this is added, do this thing, but you can't actually add anything to the existing Android structures because they're not there yet. But at the end, you can. That's why the Firebase one is at the end, because it's saying, okay, you've done all this work, all your Android stuff is set up, now I'm going to iterate through them and make sure that I have an ID for all of the outputted bundle IDs, stuff like that. So the sources are automatically added, because that stuff is also in the classes that you can access. You can add it, just like if you wanted to add an external source folder, like if you were building something that is a generated file, the same way that you can add a source folder that is not just source Java. You can link into that in the Gradle system. So that's how that gets accomplished. So as I went over, all of this becomes kind of magical from where I sit. It means that on my machine, builds are fast, refreshes are fast. On the CI server, I can keep all of the apps up to date with the source of truth, which is our backend system, without me having to have anything in my actual code base to muddy it up. Because that's the big risk. What is the source of truth if you've got stuff happening in a database and stuff happening in a code repo somewhere? Those things get out of sync, and who's right? That becomes a big problem especially if you're talking about Android and iOS and websites. Like, things need to stay in sync. So this will be the first thing that I want to show you. All of that functionality comes from this giant plugin, and it's so big. It is 130 lines of code. That's all it took to accomplish all of that functionality. The couple of pieces that I'm going to point out here, the apply function is the big deal in Gradle plugins. I'm about to. If I can find it. Where's my Zoom? Nope. Well, I was trying to do that.
Command plus.
That's there we go. So the apply is the big deal here. So that's where the work actually gets done. There's a few other functions that, if depending on what you're trying to accomplish, you may want to look into. But the apply is where it's actually going to get where the rubber meets the road, if you will. And because this is at the end of a Gradle file, all of your other configurations that you set up in Gradle have already executed. And so you get here, and it's going to take in this case, you can add options through a JSON file. I'm not going to get into that right now, but you can configure a different route other than next to the project. That's where the CI server comes in. You could technically point it wherever the heck you felt like, as long as you can list out the directories. But the big deal becomes right here. So it's gonna start looking for this folder white label, and then iterate through it. And then for each of the folders it finds, it's gonna create a product flavor. That's all it does. Now, none of that is documented anywhere. All of this was through strict discovery of, okay, I found this project, and I figured out how to get the Android app extension out of it, and then I started digging into the classes, because that's the best documentation you're going to find about any of this stuff. It's very, very bad. The last piece, when you get through, are these special files that are specific to the plugin. In this case, manifest placeholders, application suffix, and your build configs, if you need flags and things like that. But other than that, everything else is using the actual source sets and adding on, if the folder exists, those sources to the system. It's that easy. And I'm not lying about it being 130 lines of code. It really is very simple. And it took me months to write those 130 lines of code because of the documentation issues. So you've identified a problem that you think can be solved with a Gradle plugin. It used to be that now you've got to go figure out Groovy, which as an Android person, the most you've used Groovy is probably Gradle. So now it's actually a lot easier. There's all sorts of instructions on how to use Kotlin in your Gradle plugins, which is a huge lifesaver for those of us who don't use Groovy every day. But Groovy has its advantages in some places. I'm not gonna badmouth it because it can do some really magical things. The big part that you look at, like I pointed out, in that apply, you're taking in a project. It's your Android project. That's whatever you're trying to do. That's the object that you're going to go dig into to figure out what can I actually do here? What's accessible? You're probably going to run into a few dead ends. There's a lot of stuff out there that is half documented on Stack Overflow through questions. But the big deal is, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, if what you are trying to do doesn't work, try applying it at the beginning of the file, at the end of the file. I'm not kidding, depending on what you're trying to do, one may work, one may not work, and who knows in terms of the actual thing you're trying to accomplish, it's whether or not you're trying to act on things as they're added or act after they're added. So the last piece of having a plugin is, okay, I've got this idea, I'm gonna go execute it, I've written some code, and it's created a jar file. And that's not how I ever use a plugin in Gradle. I just type in some magic apply plugin stuff and it just works. So you can actually add a jar file to your class path, and I'll show you in just a second here, and test it locally. And then for most stuff, if you're making a plugin open source type stuff, Gradle plugin portal is their new thing, and it's really easy. It takes about 5 minutes to add it and publish it. If you're trying to keep it private, you can do private bin trays and things like that.
Is Gradle plugin portal same as JCenter?
No, thank God. No, it is its own repo. It is, and it's just for Gradle plugins. So going to show this real quick. So this is the example app within within the plugin source code. So you can go look at this. There'll be links at the end. So here's all this standard application of stuff. And here's applying this plugin. At the top level build, this is it just going to the Gradle plugin repo and grabbing it. And this is my nicely commented out line for when I'm testing locally. You can just add it to the libs folder and just reference it in the class path, and Gradle will find it. It is very easy. Don't be afraid of that part. Be afraid of the lack of documentation, but not of actually trying to build it. So to give you a little bit more example, I don't know that I can zoom in very well with this, but this is the white label directory. No, it won't let me zoom there. So you'll just have to trust me. There are 3 flavors under that. So when I look at build variants here, this is what I have. These each have a special, the standard setup, nothing special rather, but they just create the variants. So if I go in and delete that guy, he's just going to disappear. There's nothing else to do. He's gone. No more example 1. We'll bring him back. Before, what this would look like without doing anything else, all of those folders would have to be in my project folder at the right level, and I would have to muddy up my Gradle file with all of this, and adding one would involve adding everything back there. So it seems trivial when you have 1 or 2, but you get 10 or 15. At my last job, when I left there, we had 25, and we had about 30 lines of configuration per flavor. That is unmanageable in a Gradle file. So that's the basics of what that looks like. So the next thing that I wanted to show you is another thing about writing Gradle plugins and any code, right? Any code we test. So testing is actually one of the places where there's one thing that I really love about Kotlin, which is the semantic naming of functions, so that when things go wrong, it's not some mess of a camel case function name. But this goes through and it tests, this makes sure that I don't break anything before I put out a new version like you would expect. It works just like any other unit testing. The magic part that I wanted to talk about though was Groovy. Groovy can do some stuff that Kotlin can't in terms of overrides and cheating. In the other plugin that I work on, the Gradle Play Publisher, we actually use Groovy to build Gradle to then test our plugin in a way that it lets us generate that on the fly, write files, read files in a way that you couldn't actually do in Kotlin. So there is still, if you want to get really crazy, you may still want to look at using Groovy to compile this stuff because it can give you a lot more flexibility, but it can also shoot you in the foot real fast for that same reason, because you can override things that you don't mean to. So going through here, there's the stuff that you can set up is, for this particular plugin, is really straightforward. But the biggest thing is being able to have the confidence to go build a plugin and use it. I'm sure that everybody in here can think of at least one thing, either in a job they're at now, something they've done in the past, an open source project, where there's something you do repetitive about it that this could solve, maybe. Not everything has a solution like that, but a lot of them do. So to that end, what questions can I help answer in terms of plugins in general, this plugin specifically?